There are moments in life that force a person into silence, just so the pain won't break them one more time. Caleb Thorne believed he had buried his past deep in the Timberfall Range, until the day he looked into the eyes of a husky everyone called dangerous. What no one knew was that the dog carried the last secret of the person Caleb loved most, and that single encounter would pull him into a journey of redemption he never expected. The first cold wind of autumn came down off the Timberfall Range like a quiet warning, sliding through the yellowed aspens and the dark pines, carrying with it the smell of distant snow and wood smoke. Out here in the high country of western Montana, the sky felt wider than it had any right to be. A pale blue bowl stretched over ridgelines that rose and broke like frozen waves. The land looked empty from a distance. Long backs of hills, dry creek beds, patches of sage and scrub. But anyone who'd lived there long enough knew it was full of small, stubborn lives clinging on in the wind. Elk ghosts slipping through the timber, hawks riding the currents, and one man in a weather-beaten cabin halfway up the spine of Timberfall who had been trying for 4 long years to convince himself he was one of those creatures built to live alone. Caleb Thorne was 41, though the mountains and what had happened before he came to them had carved 10 extra years into the lines around his eyes. He was tall, in that rangy way of men who spend more time on uneven ground than on floors. Shoulders broad under an old brown leather jacket that had seen better days, cuffs darkened by sweat and work. The brim of his dust-colored hat shaded a face that had once been open and easy with laughter, but was now all planes and edges. Dark beard, too long to be tidy, nose broken slightly to one side, eyes the color of old storm clouds that had forgotten how to break. He wore worn denim, scuffed boots, a revolver that rarely left its holster, and he moved with the careful quiet of someone who had learned the hard way that sudden sounds could mean the end of something you loved. Before the mountain, there had been another life in a valley town 3 hours south. A wife who loved the idea of a steady man more than the man himself. Late-night arguments about hours and risks, and a younger brother named Jonah who'd gone from chasing strays as a boy to handling canine units for a federal task force. Jonah had been all bright grin and restless energy, the kind of man who ran toward trouble instead of away from it. He'd called Caleb from the road one winter, said he was on something big near the northern border, something he couldn't talk about yet. 2 weeks later, there was a closed casket, a polished flag, and a lot of words that didn't add up to the truth. Operational complications. No further details. Thank you for your sacrifice. The marriage had not survived the silence that followed. Caleb blamed himself for the things he'd said to Jonah before that last call, for not pushing harder for answers after. For every moment he'd chosen work or pride over sitting down at a kitchen table with the people who'd needed him. In the end, he'd done the only thing he could think to do. Sold what little he owned that mattered, packed the rest in the bed of a truck that already had more miles than sense, and driven north until the road gave out and the mountain said, "This is far enough." The only other heartbeat in the cabin was a dog, if you could call him just a dog. The husky lay sprawled on the rough plank porch most mornings, thick coat catching stray shafts of light, one ear always tilted toward the woods. Storm was his name, a 3-year-old male with a coat of white and iron gray that looked like someone had painted winter onto an animal's back. Eyes as pale and sharp as the ice floes Caleb remembered from a long-ago trip to the coast. Storm had come to Caleb half-starved and half-wild at the edge of a logging road, a ragged scrap of an animal with a torn ear and a stubborn determination to live. It had taken months of patience, scraps of jerky, and long evenings of sitting in the cold saying nothing at all for the pup to decide that this particular human might be worth his loyalty. Now Storm moved like a shadow at Caleb's heel, a creature of instinct and muscle and quiet intelligence, quick to bare his teeth at strangers, but gentle with tired hands and the occasional injured bird that died warm in his fur instead of alone on the ground. On the morning everything changed, Storm watched from the porch as Caleb cinched the tailgate of the truck and checked the old wrench set tossed in the back. Frost clung to the narrow meadow below the cabin, shining on the last of the wildflowers. The sun was up, but weak, struggling to burn through a thin veil of high cloud. "Just the town," Caleb muttered, more to himself than to the dog. "In and out." The truck had been complaining for weeks, rattling each time he asked it to climb the long dirt switchbacks down into the valley. He'd stretched it as far as he could. Out here, a busted truck could mean the difference between making it through a winter or spending it cold and hungry, and he was too seasoned to pretend otherwise. Storm huffed, tail flicking once, then leapt into the passenger seat without needing to be asked. Caleb smiled despite himself. For all his talk of staying away from people, he'd never quite managed to stay away from dogs. They drove down out of Timberfall with the windows cracked just enough to let in the smell of pine and dust. The road wound in lazy, dangerous curves, sometimes clinging to the mountainside by nothing more than a strip of gravel and old fence posts leaning like tired sentries. Caleb drove one-handed, fingers loose on the wheel, the other hand resting on the worn curve of the shifter, eyes scanning habitually for rockfall, for stray cattle, for the occasional elk that thought the road belonged to it. Storm rode upright, head just below the window, nose working constantly, catching the layers of scent as they passed. Cold rock, sap, old snow hiding in the shadows, and, as they dropped lower, the faint tang of wood smoke and people. Red Marston appeared the way it always did, suddenly, like the land had been keeping a secret until the last bend. One main street, not much more than a strip of cracked asphalt lined with brick and timber buildings that had all been painted the same few colors over and over again for 50 years. There was the feed store with its peeling green sign, May's Forge with its soot-streaked roof and iron horseshoe nailed above the door for luck, the diner that sold wheat coffee and surprisingly good pies, and on the edge of town, the old corral where ranchers brought in stock, traded horses, and settled arguments they didn't want spilling into other parts of their lives. This morning, the town felt wrong the moment Caleb rolled in. Too many horses tied to the rails, too many trucks parked crooked where people had abandoned them in a hurry. The usual mid-morning quiet was replaced by a low hum, the sound of men's voices riding on the air. Storm lifted his head, ears pricking, a low vibration starting in his chest. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Folks in Red Marston could gather for only a handful of reasons: trouble, celebration, or something that might turn from one into the other. He'd meant to head straight to the garage at the far end of the street, talk to old Gus about a new fuel pump and maybe a used belt if the man had one. Instead, he found his hands turning the wheel toward the corral almost of their own accord. "We look, then we go," he told himself. "No more than that." He eased the truck up alongside a line of dusty pickups and cut the engine. Storm was out the door before Caleb had fully stepped down, hackles raised but silent, scanning the cluster of bodies ahead. They walked together toward the weathered rails. As Caleb drew closer, the scene resolved into details. 6 cowboys stood along the far side of the corral, hats pulled low, hands resting not quite casually on the butts of their revolvers or hooked over belt buckles. They were men he half recognized from the rare times he'd come down for supplies. Stocky Levi Hargreave, with his crooked grin gone today, tall Owen Pike, whose temper was as quick as his draw, and a few younger hands with faces still soft under the dust, all trying to look braver than they felt. Their eyes were fixed on the center of the corral, on the animal pacing a torn track into the dirt. It was a husky, but not like Storm. This one was bigger, heavier in the shoulders, with a coat that seemed to drink the light, bands of charcoal and silver and white flowing together. Its tail was a plume, held low but stiff, every muscle in the body bunched tight as a coiled spring. The dog's lips were peeled back from long, white fangs in a soundless snarl, breath coming in hard, fast bursts that sent small clouds of dust skittering. Pale blue eyes, too bright, almost unnatural against the dark mask of its face, cut from man to man, never resting long enough on any one of them to be predictable. A heavy rope halter hung around its neck, frayed and dark in places where it had been dragged through mud and worse. The end of the rope trailed in the dirt, useless, now that no one was willing to take hold of it. "That's him," someone near Caleb muttered. "That's the one from the Holly Ranch. Tore into Jed like he was nothing more than a rag." Another voice, older, more measured. "Jed's the fool who tried to grab him by the collar when he was cornered. Dog like that, you don't reach straight for his throat unless you want yours torn out." "Doesn't change the fact he's dangerous, Doc. Look at him. You tell me that's an animal that'll ever be safe." "Name's Fang," a third man put in, spitting into the dirt. "Fang's what the Holly boy called him anyway. Fitting, I'd say." Caleb let the talk wash over him, standing a little back from the main knot of townsfolk, hat brim low, hands in his jacket pockets. He liked it that way, unremarkable, easy to ignore. People were less inclined to ask questions if they weren't quite sure when you'd arrived. From here he could see the whole corral, the splintered rail where something big and strong had thrown itself against it more than once, the trampled circle of ground where the husky had been dancing his war dance for the better part of an hour, and the men ringed around him, sweating under their hats even in the cool air, more scared than they wanted to admit. Storm stood pressed against Caleb's leg, ears flat, a growl rattling softly through his ribs, not aimed at the husky, but at the tension itself. Caleb set one hand on the dog's head without looking. "Easy," he murmured. "We're just watching." That's when he saw her, May Holler, standing off to the side of the corral near the gate, a leather apron still tied around her waist, soot smeared along one cheekbone like war paint she'd forgotten to wipe off. May was in her late 20s, shorter than most of the men, but with a way of standing that made her seem taller, shoulders square, chin up. Her hair, a dark auburn that blaze-brightened in the sun, was braided back in a loose, practical plait, wisps escaping to curl around her temples. May ran the forge in town after her father's heart had given out 5 winters ago, and she had the forearms to prove it, all lean muscle and old burns. She was watching the husky with a kind of focused sorrow, brows drawn together, hands fisted in the front of her apron to keep from doing something reckless. When her gaze slid away from the dog, it landed on Caleb. For a second, her expression shifted, recognition, a flicker of something softer, quickly masked. May had seen him before like this, standing at the edges of crowds, at supply auctions, outside the diner door when he thought nobody would notice, always half in shadow. She'd heard enough in passing to know he lived up on Timberfall, alone, that he came down only when he had to, that he talked more easily to the old mechanic or the feed sacks than to the folks who wanted to invite him in for coffee. What she didn't know, what no one in Red Marston knew, was that there were nights Caleb lay awake in his cabin listening to the wind claw at the logs and thinking of all the ways a human life could go sideways in an instant. She only knew that when he looked at the husky, his face changed. The hard line of his jaw eased a fraction. His eyes, usually distant, sharpened. It was as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. "He went for Jed Hawley's throat, Caleb," May called quietly as he drew near, her voice low so it wouldn't carry to the more excitable men by the fence. "They say Jed barely made it to the truck. Sheriff's thinking put him down. Folks are scared." Caleb didn't answer right away. He stepped closer to the rail, the rough wood pressing into his palms. Fang, if that was his name, caught the movement and swung toward him, dust flying in a sharp arc from his paws. The growl that ripped out of the dog's chest was deeper than any sound Storm had ever made, the kind of noise that came from somewhere primitive and old. Men cursed and shifted back, hands going to their guns. "Careful, Thorn," someone snapped. "He's not like your mud over there. That one's touched." Caleb barely heard them. For a heartbeat, machine clean and perfect, the world narrowed down to the line between his eyes and the Husky's. Those eyes were wild, yes, but not blind. There was a thin white scar cutting across one of them, a little crescent near the outer corner, and for some reason that small mark punched the air out of Caleb's lungs. Jonah had had a scar almost like that, earned the day a training dog had misread a signal and clipped him with a tooth, left him bleeding and laughing at the same time, blood on his face and joy in his eyes because, "It means we're finally getting somewhere, Caleb, don't you see?" The memory hit like a fist. For a second the corral faded and all he could see was his brother's face, grinning, the way he had in that last photo before the flag and the folded hands and the speeches that said nothing. Caleb swallowed hard and blinked. When his vision cleared, Fang had gone oddly still. The dog's ears were still pinned, hackles still raised like a brush fire along his spine, but his eyes, the fury in them, had flickered, revealing something beneath it. Not submission, not yet, but a raw, desperate plea, as clear to Caleb as if the dog had spoken out loud. "Help me. Please." Storm's growl cut off mid-rumble. The Husky's gaze flicked to him, then back to Caleb, and in that tiny, trembling instant, the man from the mountain recognized the same thing he woke up with every morning. A creature who'd learned that the world could turn on you without warning and had decided the only safe choice was to stay dangerous. "That's not hate," Caleb said under his breath. "That's fear." May's voice came from his left, soft but shaking. "Does it matter what you call it? If he's already gone for someone's throat." Before he could answer, one of the younger cowboys lost his nerve. "Enough, John!" Owen Pike barked, boots thudding as he pushed away from the fence. "We keep giving that beast time, he's gonna take another man's face off. Sheriff's right. We end it." There were nods, some eager, some reluctant. Hands tightened on gun grips. The sheriff himself, a square-shouldered man named Briggs, with gray at his temples and a mustache he trimmed every Sunday like a ritual, stepped forward with his rifle already resting in the crook of his arm. His jaw was clenched, not with cruelty, but with the grim determination of someone who'd buried more animals and men than he cared to count. "Back off the fence," he ordered. "All of you. I'll make it quick." Fang sensed the shift, like a storm feels pressure. He exploded toward the line of men in a flurry of dirt and muscle, lungs ripping out a sound that made Storm whine and drop into a crouch. The men lurched back, swearing. The rail shuddered, dust raining from it. A woman screamed somewhere in the crowd. In that ragged heartbeat of panic, decisions hardened. "That's it!" Owen shouted. "Shoot him, Briggs!" May flinched, fingers digging into the apron at her waist. She looked at Caleb, and what he saw in her eyes wasn't fear for the men. It was a raw, helpless sorrow for the animal in the ring. She'd spent most of her life watching things get bent and broken and reforged. She knew the difference between metal ruined beyond use and metal that just needed a gentler hand. But she didn't have the authority to step in, not here, not in front of all these men raised on the old rules of the range. Caleb felt something move inside his chest then, a slow, grinding shift, like rock giving way on a slope that had been waiting years to slide. Jonah's face. The way his mother had looked at the closed casket. The way his wife's eyes had turned to stone when he'd chosen silence over spilling out the mess inside him. The long, hard winters on Timberfall where staying alive had felt less like living and more like punishment. Maybe this wasn't his business. Maybe it should have stayed that way. But the thought of hearing that rifle crack and watching those pale eyes go flat, knowing there was something there no one else was even trying to see, that, somehow, felt worse than every regret he already carried. "Don't," Caleb said. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a blade. Briggs hesitated, finger resting against the trigger guard. Heads turned. "What did you say?" the sheriff asked. Caleb stepped forward, storm shadowing him. Dust crunched under his boots. For the first time since he'd rolled into town, he pulled his hat back enough for people to really see his face. "I said, don't shoot him." There was a ripple of disbelief. "You want to go in there and cuddle him, mountain man?" Owen scoffed. "Be my guest. We'll be here to pick up what's left of you." "I want to try something else," Caleb replied, voice low but steady. Years of holding his tongue made each word feel like a nail being pried loose from old boards. He met Briggs's gaze. "Give me a minute. If it goes bad, you'll still have your shot." Briggs studied him, weighing risk against the regret of acting too soon. He'd heard rumors, same as everyone else, that Thorne had worked dogs once, down south, before the mountain had swallowed him. He saw something in the man's eyes now that he recognized. A man who'd lost too much already and wasn't about to let another life, even a four-legged one, go without a fight. Finally, the sheriff grunted. "You got 1 minute. After that, I'm taking the shot whether you're in there or not." May sucked in a breath. "Caleb, you don't have to." "Yeah," he said softly. "I think I do." Without waiting for more protest, he swung himself up and over the fence, landing light in the dust inside the corral. Storm stayed outside, whining uneasily, nails scratching the rail as if wanting to follow and knowing he shouldn't. The world inside the ring felt smaller somehow, the air thick with the copper taste of fear and old sweat. Fang wheeled to face him, paws digging furrows, foam flecking the corners of his mouth. Up close, the dog was even more striking, built for endurance and speed, not just brute force, but right now every line of him was tuned to violence. Caleb let his arms hang loose at his sides. He didn't look directly into the dog's eyes at first. Staring down an animal this wound up could be read as a challenge. Instead, he turned his body slightly, making himself just a fraction smaller, less square on, the way Jonah had taught him in the early days with green canine recruits. "You walk in there like a wall," Jonah had said once, tossing a ball and watching a young German shepherd test his boundaries. "They're gonna hit you like a hammer. You walk in like you're willing to listen. Sometimes they listen back." Caleb took one slow step forward. Dust whispered under his boot. Fang's snarl dropped in pitch, becoming something more complex. The dog's eyes flickered to Caleb's hands, to his shoulders, to his face, reading him as surely as any man might. Caleb lifted one hand, palm open, fingers loose, showing it was empty. No rope, no stick, no weapon. He let his breathing stay slow, his heartbeat, though it pounded, show only in the hollow of his throat, not in the tension of his posture. Around them, the town held its breath. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured, voice low and even, the tone more important than the words. His throat felt dry. "You've had a rough run. I can see that. But I'm not here to hurt you." Another step. Fang's growl lapsed, resumed, lapsed again, like waves hitting rock and pulling back. He was trembling now, the kind of tremor that came not from weakness, but from the sheer effort of holding himself ready to explode. For a second, Caleb glimpsed scars under the fur, thin, white lines around the neck where a collar had once bitten too deep, an old burn near one shoulder. Someone had used this animal hard. Someone had taught him the world only understood force. They were close enough now that Caleb could see the small things no one on the rails could. The way Fang's ears kept twitching toward the exits as if calculating escape. The way his paws were planted more back than forward, as if he wanted distance more than blood. "You're not attacking," Caleb said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "You're warning them." Their eyes met fully then, no dodging, no sidelong glances. It was like staring into a winter river, fast and dangerous and shockingly clear. In that instant, the fury peeled back just enough for Caleb to see the raw wound under it. The trail, confusion, pain so deep it had curdled into this constant state of ready violence. Jonah's face flashed again in his mind. That last conversation, the words Caleb had thrown like knives because it was easier to be angry than afraid. He'd never gotten the chance to take them back. Maybe this was nothing more than a foolish man trying to balance scales that were never going to be even. But the pull of it was undeniable. Fang hesitated. His front paw lifted, hovered, then came down half an inch closer to Caleb, a movement so small most of the men watching thought they had imagined it. Caleb saw it. More than that, he felt it. The breaking of a line drawn tight between life and death, the first thread of trust fraying its way through. And as Fang shifted, the ragged fur around his neck parted just enough for Caleb to notice something he hadn't seen before. A shard of dull metal caught in the rope, pressed up against the dog's skin. It was about the size of a thumbnail, edges worn, stamped with a symbol Caleb hadn't seen in 4 years but could have drawn from memory in the dark. The insignia of the federal unit Jonah had died working for. The breath punched out of him. The corral, the rails, the men, even the dog seemed to tilt for a heartbeat as the mountain he'd built between himself and his past buckled. Fang's growl rose again, uncertain. Caleb's hand stayed steady, palm still open, but his world had already shifted. Whatever this dog was, whatever he'd done or not done, he was carrying more than scars. He was carrying a message from a dead man. And Caleb Thorne, who had come down the mountain that morning just to buy a part for an old truck, realized with the cold clarity of mountain water that nothing about his life was going to stay the same after this. Caleb Thorne had never meant to leave Red Marston with more than a fuel pump and a handful of bolts, yet the ride back up the Timberfall switchbacks felt heavier than any load he'd hauled in years. The husky, Fang, lay curled in the bed of the truck on a blanket Caleb kept for emergencies, his breaths shallow but steady, blue eyes tracking every shape that moved along the tree line, as though danger lived in every shadow. The wind sharpened as they climbed, turning colder and thinner, threading through the tall pines that crowned the slopes. Behind them, the lights of Red Marston flickered out one by one, swallowed by distance and dusk. If Caleb listened hard enough, he could still hear the murmurs of the townsfolk, accusations, warnings, disbelief. But none of it reached him as sharply as the quiet footsteps that had followed him to the truck earlier. May Holler, small against the vastness of the corral, holding a battered tin of antiseptic and a hand-knit wool scarf she insisted Fang would need when night fell. She hadn't said much, just met his gaze with a steadiness that asked nothing of him, and in that simple look, Caleb had found something he didn't realize he'd been starving for. Grace, without conditions. Timberfall rose before him like a dark cathedral, its ridges layered in the blue light of early night. When they reached the cabin clearing, Storm bounded out first, tail stiff in suspicion, but not hostility. Fang did not growl this time. Instead, he watched Storm with a wary resignation, as though trying to measure whether the other dog was a rival or something closer to kin. Caleb carried Fang's weight into the cabin with more care than he'd shown another living thing in a long while. Storm paced beside them, occasionally sniffing Fang's shoulder, the torn scar there twitching under the touch. Caleb cleaned the wound as best he could by lantern light, May's antiseptic burning sharp in the air. When it stung, Fang didn't snap. He only held Caleb's gaze, as if memorizing the face of the man who had chosen not to give up on him. The first 2 days passed in a rhythm that surprised Caleb with its gentleness. Fang slept more than he woke, muscles jumping in dreams that Caleb knew were not the harmless kind. Storm slept near him, not touching, but close enough that Fang could feel another heartbeat in the room. Steady, calm, refusing to be chased off. And slowly, something in the cabin shifted, the air no longer carrying the brittle tension of a battlefield, but the fragile quiet of a place learning to heal. On the third night, the wind rose earlier than usual, carrying the scent of snow, though the calendar insisted winter was still weeks away. That was when Fang began to pace. Not restlessly, purposefully. His paws scratched lines into the wooden floor, hackles rising only when Caleb approached the north window, the one facing the densest part of the woods. Every night it was the same. Fang would stand between Caleb and the dark, a low rumble vibrating through his ribs, warning, pleading, guarding. Storm sat behind him, confused but not dismissive, as though he too sensed something in the forest that did not belong. Caleb tried twice to step outside toward that northern stretch, but Fang blocked him both times, planting himself firmly in front of the door, body rigid and trembling with an emotion that felt too layered to name. Fear, protection, memory, guilt. All of it crackled in the air like static before lightning. During the days, May came. She never arrived with fanfare, just the soft crunch of boots approaching through needle-littered ground and a gentle knock she knew Caleb could hear long before she reached the porch. As promised, she helped him repair the broken hinge on the old storage shed and then, when that was done, offered to reinforce the latch on Fang's temporary stall, even though they both understood Fang wasn't the kind of creature who could be contained by wood and nails. She worked easily, sleeves rolled to her elbows, soot smudges on her cheek, even on days she hadn't touched the forge. Caleb found himself watching her hands more than he meant to, the way her fingers curled around a hammer, steady and unafraid, the way she brushed hair from her face with a wrist thick with small burn scars. Over shared tasks they began to talk, slowly, hesitantly at first. Caleb told her about Jonah, not all at once, but in pieces. The way his brother laughed louder than anyone in the room, the fearlessness that had made him both admirable and impossible to manage. The coded hints he'd left in phone calls near the end. May listened with the kind of attention that didn't try to fix anything, only held space for it. And when he fell quiet, May surprised him by confessing her own story. How the man she once loved had left town because he didn't believe a woman should run a forge. How she'd spent 2 years convinced he'd been right. How one morning she woke to the sound of her own heartbeat asking who she was living for. They shared those truths in the soft afternoon light, neither looking directly at the other for fear of seeing something too raw reflected back. But the air between them warmed, subtle and steady, like embers coaxed back to life. Then came the night everything changed. The wind screamed through the eaves with a ferocity that rattled the shutters, and the sky, stripped of stars, hung heavy with storm clouds. Caleb had just banked the fire when Fang rose from his place near the hearth. For the first time since arriving, he lifted his muzzle and let out a sound that froze Caleb where he stood. It wasn't a howl for the moon or a cry of challenge. It was grief made audible, an aching, hollow, distant sound that seemed to come from the farthest edge of the forest and the deepest edge of the dog's heart. Storm whimpered and stepped behind Caleb's legs. Fang didn't look away from the north woods. He barked once, sharp, commanding, and ran for the door. Caleb didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, lantern, and rifle, though he felt in his bones the weapon wouldn't matter against whatever waited out there. Fang led them through underbrush that clawed at coats and tore at boots, Storm trailing close. The night was a maze of roots and old trees leaning like watchers, but Fang never faltered. They reached a wall of thorn-thick brush Caleb had never noticed before. Not surprising. Timberfall had ways of hiding what it didn't want seen, but tonight the dog shoved through it as if breaking open a long-buried truth. Beyond the brush, a narrow path cut through dense ferns and fallen logs, leading to a clearing Caleb would have sworn had never existed. There, half buried under moss and vine, squatted a metal bunker door, its surface dented, edges warped, a symbol burned faintly into the steel, the insignia of Jonah's old unit. Caleb felt the world drop out from under him. Fang pressed forward, body trembling, tail low, ears pinned back in a mixture of dread and desperate longing. Caleb knelt, brushing vines aside, revealing the broken lock. Someone had forced their way in or out. Inside, the bunker was colder than the wind outside, air thick with dust and the metallic scent of something burned long ago. Fang led them to a half-collapsed shelf where a stack of papers lay scattered. Most were unrecognizable, scorched into curls of black, but one small notebook had survived, barely. Caleb opened it with shaking hands. Jonah's handwriting, rushed but unmistakable, filled the first few pages. The last line, half a sentence, smudged as if written in haste, read, "If I don't make it back, the husky with the scar on his left shoulder will know the way to you." Caleb's knees gave out. The lantern flickered as he dropped to the ground, the cold of the bunker seeping through his bones. Fang stepped close and, for the first time, pressed his head against Caleb's leg. Not as a warning, not in fear, but in grief shared between species who had both lost the same man. Storm stood beside them, silent, forming the final point of a triangle of mourning. When they returned to the cabin at dawn, May was waiting on the porch, shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't ask why they were gone or what they'd found. The exhaustion in Caleb's eyes told her enough. Over the next days, she helped Caleb reinforce the bunker door, nailing beams into place while Fang watched with the calm focus of a dog who'd finally completed an impossible task. One evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge in a blaze of orange, Caleb found himself standing beside May, Fang at their feet, Storm curled nearby. The light turned May's hair copper, and something in Caleb, something long, numb, stirred with new warmth. "Maybe," he said, voice low and uncertain. "Timberfall's not as empty as it used to be." May's answering smile was small but sure. Fang lifted his head, eyes softer now, as though acknowledging that the family he'd lost had found its shape again, different, imperfect, but alive. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt that Timberfall might not just be a place to hide from ghosts, but a place where the dead could finally rest and the living could begin again. In the end, Caleb learned something the mountains had been trying to tell him for years. Sometimes the healing we search for does not arrive loudly. It comes in small signs, in unexpected companions, in the quiet courage to open the door we once closed forever. Some might call it chance, but those who have walked through heartbreak know better. There is a kind of grace that moves ahead of us, preparing the way, placing the right souls in our path at the right moment. It is the kind of miracle only God can weave through the ordinary days of a wounded life. And maybe that is the real lesson. No matter how far we wander or how silent our grief becomes, God still finds ways to call us home. Sometimes through people, sometimes through a loyal animal, sometimes through a whisper in the wind that says, "You are not alone anymore." If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of the journey spoke to you. And if you want more stories of healing, faith, and second chances, make sure you subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and everyone watching, wherever you are, and may He guide your steps the way He guided Caleb's.